Hello and welcome to this third episode on corporate governance. We have with us Mr. S.V.S. Subramaniam, who is an institution in his own right and the chairman of the Secretarial Standards Board of the ICSI. And we also have Mr. Sethuraman, Group Company Secretary, Reliance Industries Limited. In this episode, we're going to discuss the role of a company secretary under the Companies Act 2013, what is expected of him, what sort of a career prospect a company secretary has, in-house in a company, externally as a practitioner, and we have the benefit of two very senior and respected members of the profession. Thank you for joining us. May I begin by asking you to give a very broad overview in as detailed a manner as possible about the new Companies Act 2013 and what role you see in it for company secretaries, and which are the areas where life is going to change materially because of a company secretary's role in the life of a company.
The new Companies Act, for the first time, has defined the functions of a company secretary. When we talk of company secretary, we are talk of two types of secretaries. One is an employed company secretary, an employed with the organization, and a secretary who has taken up practice for himself. The functions of an employed company secretary has been very clearly given in the Act itself. It says the company secretary should report to the board about compliance with the provisions of this Act, which is the Companies Act of 2013, and the rules made thereunder, and all other laws applicable to the company, and to ensure that the company complies with the applicable secretarial standards, and to discharge such other duties that may be entrusted to him. Now, as far as the employed company secretary is concerned, these are, even though briefly said, compliance is one of the essential ingredients of his duty. Mm-hmm. And this kind of a responsibility is fixed on the company secretary because of his inherent qualifications and the nature of his duty. In addition, secretarial audit has been introduced for the prescribed companies, particularly the listed companies. Secretarial audit and a certification of annual returns are the two essential works given to the practicing company secretary. Now, it is the responsibility of the employed company secretary to provide all material information to the auditing practicing company secretary, and the practicing company secretary has to, after completing his audit, ultimately give a certification to the company, which will be attached to the annual return.
So, would you compare the roles, like the role between an internal auditor and a statutory auditor? Likewise, the employed company secretary would be the sentinel in-house, and the practicing company secretary would be the external person who looks at compliance.
The employed secretary does not give any certification to anyone, whereas an internal auditor gives his report to the internal management for consideration, and that supports the external auditor's findings.
Right.
Whereas the employed secretary has to ensure that everything is done properly, all the compliances have been made, and periodically report it to the board and to confirm that all compliances have been made.
Right.
If any compliance is not made, it is for him to make that correction.
Right.
Okay. Whereas the practicing company secretary, who is going to do the secretarial audit, he will look at the support of the employed company secretary in terms of information, in terms of additional pieces of evidence which he will require to substantiate his case, and finally he takes the responsibility of certifying that all requirements have been duly complied with.
Right.
Okay. If there is any kind of false statement, then he is liable for penalty. The practicing company secretary is liable for penalty.
Right. So, would you like to supplement any of on a broad role of a company secretary under the Act?
Yes, in addition to what Mr. Subramaniam made a mention, I think he has a role to play as an advisor to the board of directors and to the board members individually or collectively to the board of directors of the company as to governance aspects, as to compliance of various requirements of law to be done into the account, and he's also guide the board of directors of the company on the corporate affairs, other things. And a company secretary, as you know, has a pivotal role to play in convening and conducting board meetings, besides attending the board meetings. He has equally a good role to play in convening shareholders meeting, and he's a watchdog, I would put it, or he's a guard for ensuring a good corporate governance takes place by complying with the various laws applicable to the company, and in particular the Companies Act, very importantly to be noted by him. In addition to this one, he also helps, as mentioned by Mr. Subramaniam, the practicing company secretary in discharging their function, and the various forms which are filed by the company. As company secretary has got a good role to play because he should be very clear, keeping in view the penal provisions in the Companies Act, especially section 448 comes to my mind first. If he makes a false statement, or in the determined he is filed over there, knowingly is a false statement over there, he incurs penalty mentioned under section 447. And while his role has been enhanced substantially in the Companies Act 2013, he should be equally aware of the penal provisions if he does not comply with the requirement of law.
So would you say that the Act in that sense has made a significant departure from the 56 Act in terms of what role is envisaged? If you say that he's now also got an advisory role in the scheme of the law, as opposed to somebody who's normally considered as someone who checks the boxes and ensures that every stone is turned, but now it goes a step beyond to also have an advisory role on how governance should be met by a company.
I think company secretary even earlier has been a conscience keeper of the company.
Right.
Today he has got a little legal backing,
Right.
that he is considered as an expert in his own area and he is expected to advise the board. Okay, and because of that he has been made a key managerial personnel.
Right.
One of the reasons as to why he was made a key managerial personnel is that even though he was a conscience keeper, even though he was able to advise the board, a legal backing was required.
Right.
That is the reason. That is the recognition that the Act has given.
Right. So I'll come to the key managerial personnel in a moment. But would it be fair to then say that if a company secretary were to not advise properly or were to give blatantly wrong advice on matters of governance in a common law suit, it would be open to a victim of a tort to sue even the company secretary who was meant to be that professional who would be a conscience keeper but failed in providing the quality of service expected of him?
It's a debatable point. A company secretary is giving an advice to the board of directors.
Right.
And ultimately it is the wisdom of the board of directors that determines what kind of action they have to follow. Therefore, it is very difficult for anyone to say whether the company secretary has given the correct advice or not.
Right.
And whether it was followed or not is a different question.
Right.
So
you mentioned company secretary is a key managerial personnel now. The definition explicitly includes him, in fact, right after the CEO, MD or whole-time director as a key managerial person. Can you throw some light on what was the legislative intent behind introducing the very concept of key managerial person?
Under the
I mean, also even beyond the scope of just the company secretary, why is KMP as a concept being made so important?
Right. In the 1956 Act, officer and officer in default are the two expressions used for compliances of the various provisions of the Act as also for attracting penal provisions. And it was the one of 1956 Act, as you know very well. As after 5 decades, the business has grown very well, whereby there was a need for appointing other professionals like a CFO. And anyway, Company Secretary was there because of his responsibilities and other things over there. He has been elevated to the position of a key managerial personnel. CEO is another concept which has been introduced in the key managerial personnel concept. Because companies have diversified in various businesses over there, it therefore warrants for a company to appoint a CEO. CEO being a person in charge of running the affair of the company, of a particular business over there, not being a board member, he has a vital role to play.
Right.
Therefore, he should be given a due recognition as a key managerial personnel. Therefore, compared to the earlier 56 provision, the new additions are CEOs, CFOs, and company secretary. Coming to CFO also has a good role to play in the company's activities, managing the funds of the company. That is why all the 3 of them are coming to the level of a KMP, while earlier manager, managing director, and company secretaries were bracketed under the definition officer and officer in default.
Right. So again, coming back to then the key managerial personnel, what does the Act then do about this concept in terms of Section 203 or any of the relevant provisions?
Yes.
Could you throw some light for the viewers on what are the provisions that affect the key managerial personnel of a company?
Yes. The draft rules say company having paid up capital of rupees 5 crore or more should have key managerial personnel.
So they have to have an MD, they have to have
an MD or a CEO who would not be a member of the board,
right,
or a manager. In the absence of the 3, the whole-time director should be appointed.
So be it public or private, net worth based criteria.
No, it is a paid up capital based.
Paid up capital based criteria. Right.
And in addition to these people, these companies having more than 5 crore paid up capital and above should have a CFO as well as a company secretary in employment. They are all in the whole time employment of the company.
Right. And they can only have one job at a time?
Yes, the Act clearly provides that a whole-time key managerial personnel can be holding the office in more than one company, and that company can be only a subsidiary company. Apart from that, an exception has been carved out in the section. A managing director of a company can be also a managing director of another company, need not necessarily subsidiary company, provided the board of directors of the other company appointing him should appoint him unanimously. That is the only carve out made only for managing director. In other words, other than managing director, a manager or a CFO or a CEO or a company secretary, if they were to be appointed in another company, other company can be only a subsidiary company. Another provision in the Act very importantly brings up under Section 203 that an individual who is a chairman and managing director cannot hold the office as a combined position as a chairman and managing director. He used to hold this office has been split into chairman, non-executive chairman, and managing director. An exception has been again made out in the section itself, clearly saying that if a company has only single business, then he can hold the position both as chairman and managing director.
Right.
If he has to hold the same position as a chairman and managing director, the articles of the company can very well stipulate that he can continue to hold the dual position in the company. Further, if the company has got multiple businesses, and if those businesses are recognized by the government under the rule framing, for each type of businesses, if the company appoints, board of directors appoint a CEO, as I mentioned to you, CEO need not be company's board member, then in that case, the individual who is holding as a chairman managing director can continue to hold the dual office.
Right.
Apart from that, there is no stipulation in the Act by which time the position of a KMP should be filled in. Now that clearly provides that within 6 months from whenever a vacancy arises in the office of a key managerial personnel, within 6 months from the date of the vacancy created, it has to be really filled in.
Right.
Further, a key managerial personnel, if he is to be appointed even as a director simpliciter in another company, the board of directors of the company where he is a KMP should approve such an appointment to be made in other company as a director simpliciter.
So if a CFO were to be made an independent director in another company, the board which employs that CFO would still have to sign off as a matter of statutory law today.
Yes, that has been clearly provided.
You see, if all these personnel, whole-time personnel, they are supposed to be in the whole-time employment of the company.
Right.
Therefore, it is logical that if they are going to devote some of their time for any other company outside this business group, naturally they have to have the permission of the current board of directors.
Right.
That is only extended now by way of law.
Right. As a statutory provision.
Statutory.
That's right. Do you think there is enough number of resources in the ecosystem to supply these many key managerial personnel to the corporate sector in India?
Yeah, the law has now prescribed the requirement over there. I am very sure that over a period of time, this gap should be filled in. It will get filled in. May not be. There could be some gaps today,
right,
likely, which I am not sure about it. If there are likely gaps over there, with the legal with the legal requirement, these will get filled in, and create a lot of opportunities for experienced professional
right,
in finance, in accounts, in corporate secretarial activities, to fill the position over there and discharge their duties professionally for the betterment of the company's businesses and to take care of the stakeholders' interest.
Right. So would you say that a company secretary is actually then a governance professional rather than a secretarial professional?
I would imagine so. Secretarial profession is part of his duties, but with the kind of recognition he has got, I think he is expected to play a very lead role in the governance.
Right.
Therefore, rightly you should be called a governance official.
Right.
The entire responsibility,
which, as you said, is a conscience keeper.
Yes, the entire responsibility of ensuring that proper governance is taken care in the company is, I think, rightly rests on his shoulders.
Right. So could we now move on to the subject of a secretarial audit, because that's one of the areas where company secretaries in practice have to play a material role.
Yes.
I mean, I gave the allusion to a statutory auditor on the accounting side,
Right.
but here a practicing CS will need to sign off saying that governance standards are indeed being met.
Right.
So can you give an overview for the viewers of what is the nature of this audit? What does the Act require the audit to cover, and what sort of framework exists for ensuring this audit is a meaningful exercise?
Taking a cue from what we discussed earlier, I think company secretaries are to ensure corporate governance. While the company may be complying with all the requirements, it has to be validated by an outside professional. That is why the secretarial audit has been made compulsory in the new Act. The draft rules prescribe at the moment that every listed company and other companies having a paid capital of 100 crores or above should have necessarily secretarial audit in place. And the secretarial audit report is totally giving particulars about the various registers maintained by the company required by law and compliance of various other provisions in the Act by the company in its various operations and various process over there, or will be brought out by him. Like a financial audit, like a cost audit. Secretarial audit is nothing but an external audit by a secretary in practice, certifying compliances of all provisions of the Companies Act.
Right.
That gives a kind of surety to the board of directors of the company and external stakeholders, be it lenders, be it employees, be it outside peer group, everybody.
An assurance.
An assurance by an external person. That is why the secretarial audit is a very important thing. Many companies, even before enacting this new legislation, have already have secretarial audit with them by appointing secretaries in practice as well. Now it has been legalized. I would just say India is the first country, to my knowledge, is having a provision for a compulsory secretarial audit, which is the beginning of certifying compliance of all provisions of the Act.
Right. So this could range from whether returns are filed in time, to whether charges are duly filed, to whether promoter shareholding changes are being filed, to whether minutes are being properly kept, the works.
The secretarial standards have been equally followed,
Right.
because the Act clearly provides that in conducting of board meetings and shareholders meeting, the secretarial standard prescribed by under law should be strictly adhered to.
Right.
It will be recommended by our Institute of Company Secretaries of India and approved by the by the Government of India will be the standard. Presently, the section recognizes at the moment about two standards, namely standards on Board of Directors and General Meeting. And other secretarial standards may be prescribed in due course of time also should be adhered to.
This section 112.
It is one, and also section same 203 also talks about the matter. Further, the duties of secretary, as mentioned by Mr. Subramaniam, secretary also has to ensure that the company is in total compliance of the secretarial standards followed by the company as such. Like accounting standard, secretarial standards also are going to be adhered to by the company.
Right. So on the subject of secretarial standards, we have the chairman of the Secretarial Standards Board of the ICSI here. So as chairman of that standard setting division, sir, can I ask you to elaborate on how are these standards formulated, how are they stipulated, now that they have a statutory backing, are they mandatory or still of a nature of a guideline? Can we talk a bit about how these standards will work going forward?
The law is not always clear. So Companies Act was no exception. There are areas where the law is either not clear or it is amenable for different interpretations and therefore leading to different practices. The institute basically gets representation from the professional secretaries that this is the area, can you give me some clarification, how to go about it. So the institute finally identifies the areas where we need to have some kind of a standard so that every organization and every secretary will follow that particular standard. So they communicate to the standards board that these are the topics on which we require some standard.
Right.
That's the beginning. Then we have a research team who find out the various kinds of practices of different companies, the companies which are fairly reputed in the market. And they may not be identical. Therefore, we look at all those practices, take the best out of them, integrate them, and then harmonize some of those areas.
Right.
And then bring out as a standard.
Do you also publish a standard in draft form and seek public comment?
Yeah.
Or
Once then I must tell you about the board, standard board itself. It comprises of senior company secretaries in employment as well as in practice, plus representatives from various regulators like MCA, SEBI, industry associations like FICCI, CII, etc. and some independent practitioners. All of them sit together, look at all these formulas, then make a draft standard. Once the draft standard is made, it is sent to the council sort of approves it and then makes it public, inviting public comments.
okay.
We receive a lot of comments. All these comments are again gone through, and then some of them may be acceptable, some of them may not be acceptable for a variety of reasons. We prepare a chart as to what is acceptable and then why it is accepted, what is not acceptable and why it is not accepted, when it can be accepted. All these kinds of reasoning we give and then submit it to the Central Council of the Institute. The Institute again decides and then accepts those recommendations and releases it. That's why a standard comes. So far it has only been recommendatory. We have got about 10 standards so far. on the board meetings, general meetings, postal balloting, solution by circulation, and the use of common seal, on various kinds of topics.
Retention of records.
Retention of records. About 10 standards we have got. But in addition to the 10 standards, only standards are basically known to the outside world. For each of those standards, correspondingly, there are actually general instructions. Okay, it's the guidance notes they are called.
Right.
These guidance notes, standards will say what you should do precisely, whereas the guidance notes will tell you in detail how you should operate, how you should work, what are the doubts that could come, what are the areas of uncertainties. So for those things, the answers will be provided in the guidance notes.
Right.
So a person or a corporate who reads the standard as well as the guidance notes will be in full compliance, what I call it absolute compliance. That means compliance in letter and compliance in spirit.
Right.
So if they are able to follow the standard, I think there can be no mistake about it.
So when a standard is prescribed, now with the backing of law rather than merely recommendatory, in your view, would failure to adhere to the standard result in the action being illegal or in the procedure having been defaulted? So let's say there is a standard for how a meeting should be conducted.
Yes.
And that standard is not followed by inadvertently or otherwise. In your view, would it render the board meeting illegal, or would it only result in a violation in as much as the standard was not adhered to, and therefore a poor quality compliance rather than completely illegal?
I can't say it could become illegal.
Right.
It could become a violation. Ultimately, we will have to look at the consequence of that. If by that violation, what is the consequence?
Right.
A board meeting which was not following this, but a valid meeting where all the board of directors have agreed to and taken a particular decision, certainly
it will not be vitiated.
It will not be vitiated. It's not a violation. It's a violation, but it's not something where one should. But
the reason I'm asking the question is then the spotlight would shift to the company secretary professional, that an otherwise validly conducted meeting fell short of secretarial compliance standards, and therefore he would be amenable to disciplinary action by the ICSI.
If the standards are not fully followed, I doubt whether it can be a valid meeting.
Right. So you think de facto they are anyway inexorable.
Yes.
But as by and large the standard which are now recommendatory, as Mr. Subramaniam mentioned, are more in tune with the provisions of law. And the standards are not bringing out anything which is contrary to provisions of law as such. It may be a better practices can be brought out over there. The practices are talked about more in the standard and the guidance note. But whatever standards have been recommended in the secretarial standard are not contrary to any of the provisions of law.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say that they could be contrary or even conflicting. But let's say, for example, the standard says you will pass a resolution in a certain format, or you will issue a certificate for securities within a certain time frame, and that deadline is missed. So you then have to, as I see it from your answer, fall back on whether the provision in the Act was a mandatory provision or a directory provision. Therefore, if the Act doesn't render it illegal, the action is not illegal, but there would have been a default in compliance with the quality of work that is expected of the company and its potentially its company secretary as well.
Yeah, it's akin to the Act and the articles.
Right.
The articles could be little stricter than the Act. All right. Still, you cannot violate the articles.
That's
you have to go by the articles.
Yeah.
Okay. If the article says something which is negated by the Act, then you have to follow the Act.
That's right.
Standard is something like this.
Right.
Standard can prescribe sometimes a little stricter requirement than the Act itself. Right. In such cases, it is a violation of the standard, but not violation
Not
of law.
necessarily the violation.
Well, that's it. That's the point.
That's the difference.
Right. Could you, since we have the benefit of both of you, could you also talk about what are the roles the profession of a company secretary will get to play under this new act? What are the various avenues available to young and old company secretaries who are out there affiliated to the institute? What sort of statutory or otherwise avenues for their professional service have been created by the Companies Act?
The Act talks about various corporate action, beginning from prospectus, fund mobilization, conducting meetings, and inspection, investigation, liquidation, everything over there. In all these activities, I think he has a good role to play. Say, he can advise on amalgamation mergers. He can act as a member of SFIO. He can be a person in the mediation conciliation panel.
Right.
Under the Act, which has been recognized now. He can assist the company liquidator. He can render assistance to the liquidator appointed by the NCLT now. And promoters can be again advised, and he's a keeper of corporate governance, as also complies with various laws. And as Mr. Subramaniam mentioned over there, the function of a company secretary is not only confined to Companies Act. All other applicable laws of the company also is actually foreign.
Right.
Therefore, other
he
laws.
He can also appear before tribunals.
He can appear before tribunal, you are right. He can also appear before the tribunal. And he has got a lot of areas to operate upon,
right,
work upon, and practice also equally. So therefore, the role of secretary is very important. He has got a very wide role to play, and large area where he can act upon. Wherever he specializes, he can show his specialty, his skill over there in those areas, and make the profession really proud.
Okay. So since you have the benefit of both of you, can I ask you to summarize in a minute each what your advice would be with all your wide-ranging experience to the audience, which includes students of the CS course and practitioners as company secretaries. If you could summarize your advice to them, also in the light of the new act.
The main advice I would say is that you should continue to keep learning. You should never stop with that. You must be thorough in your job. You must be upright. And whatever you are going to advise, it is going to affect the corporate. Therefore, unless you are very thorough of the advice you are giving and the consequences thereof, you should consult other people and then give them that advice.
I totally agree with what Mr. Subramaniam made a mention. I think he summed up in a nice way. That is the role of a company secretary. I think one should not be afraid of the various penal provisions mentioned in the Act as an officer of default to worry about it. So long as secretary is ensuring total compliance of the Act, he will be totally regarded by the profession, by the company, by the board members, by the stakeholders, and he will stand up all the time. And only worry about if you are not complying with the requirement. And more, I would just say, let us not interpret the law for conveniences. Go by the spirit behind what every section of the Act is talking about it. Let us get into the spirit more than the legal opinion or otherwise over there. That is very, very important to follow. And that is the hallmark of this one. To give an example, many areas they have thrown open to the shareholders for approval instead of government approval. Such a liberalization has taken place. We have to ensure that all those liberal attitudes or provisions in the Act are complied with by the secretaries.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So this was a broad summary and very important advice to company secretaries following the practice of being a CS. We've had the benefit of very experienced people on this episode. The key takeaway seems to be that remember, you are conscience keepers of a corporate's existence rather than just a general check the box compliance professional. That's the key takeaway. We'd encourage you to read the relevant provisions of the Act. I was going to say chapter 7 and 13, but obviously you heard that you need to read every provision of the Companies Act if you have to be a successful company secretary. Thank you very much for joining on this episode. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.